But the United States blew it off because the U.S. the leaders are stupid. They're arrogant. They don't know what they're doing. They think they can do whatever they want.
While the American leaders may be arrogant, the European leaders are obviously spineless.
This is a European leader who wouldn't dream of saying this publicly right now. You know what? A bunch of idiots.
You make it sound like that in the upper echelons or the elite political circles, that there's a bunch of arrogant, not qualified individuals that are making decisions that are consequential for millions and millions of people on this planet.
The only thing I disagree with you is it's about billions of people.
I personally have more distrust in these global institutions than maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
I think your distrust is completely misplaced. You're missing the point.
Okay, it might be.
Where is the power?
Hello everyone, my name is Jasmine Kosebek and I speak to interesting people every week. And this week I have a real gem here in Germany, which is why I'm speaking English to everyone out there. Usually I speak German, but this is a little different because my guest is here from the United States, visiting Dr. Jeffrey Sachs. Let me introduce you. I mean, there's so much to say about you, so I just kind of summarize it in a little bit. You're one of the most influential economists of our time, at least named twice by Time magazine. You're a global leader and celebrated for your work in sustainable development. And you're also no stranger to controversy, often challenging conventional narratives. So first, maybe we'll start with what brings you to Germany. And I have this book that you have just published in the Westend Verlag, a publisher that I really enjoy working with. It's called Diplomacy or Disaster, to German Diplomatie oder Desaster. Zeitenwende in den USA, ist Frieden möglich? Zeitenwende, how would you translate that? Times changing in the USA, is peace possible? You know, what's interesting, I spoke to John Mearsheimer a couple of months ago and the thumbnail was, is peace possible? Mm-hmm. You're also friends with John Mearsheimer, not just, friends, but also intellectually, you're close. But maybe aside from promoting your book, what brings you to Germany?
I'm very happy to be here because this is a pivotal moment for the US with a new president, Germany with an upcoming election, a new European Commission, lots happening in the world. And so I'm having good discussions here in Germany about the politics and about the prospects. So for me, it's extremely timely to be here. And I'm grateful for the chance to talk about the book as well, which is about, after all, ending the Ukraine war, moving to diplomacy, having a very different kind of politics from the kind of politics that we've had for the past few years, which I think has been a failure of politics.
You're calling it a pivotal moment, and I think a lot of people would agree, is at least what happened in the United States with Trump. He just started his presidency. And you're saying it's the same for Germany with the new elections. Now, could you maybe explain that a little further? What role Germany plays, in your opinion, in the current conflict concerning Ukraine?
Well, Germany has been completely aligned with the United States. It's been a kind of bulwark of the U.S.-led policy. The Biden administration was carrying out what I think is fair to say the long-term, and I would say deep state policy of the United States, which was to expand NATO eastward, antagonize Russia, try to surround Russia, strategically weaken Russia. And Chancellor Scholz was absolutely a part of that, supporting it at every step. And I think it has gotten us into a big mess, frankly.
Do you think an independent German foreign policy is even possible?
Of course it's possible. Germany has had an independent foreign policy in the past. Willy Brandt and Ostpolitik was not a U.S. initiative. It was a German initiative. In 2003, when the U.S. stupidly went to war in Iraq, the German government, the chancellor, was outspoken. No, that's a bad idea. There have been many occasions where Germany has had its foreign policy at odds with the United States. And what brings us to the current crisis, the war in Ukraine, you can date to 2008, in a sense. That was when NATO said, we will expand to Ukraine and to Georgia, that was a decision pushed by the United States against the better judgment of European leaders who knew this is reckless, this is provocative, why stir up things in Europe? But the U.S. pushed it. And something decisive happened. Actually, Chancellor Merkel has described it in her memoirs, in her recent book. She describes how at the NATO summit in Bucharest in 2008, she and Sarkozy said to George Bush Jr., this is a bad idea. We don't want to provoke Russia. We don't need to commit to expanding NATO. And the U.S. was dead set on doing it for basically deep state reasons, which is the U.S. is the U.S. We'll do what we want. We can do what we want. What can Russia do to stop us? After all, we are the most powerful country in the world. That's the mindset.
But is that also the reason? Do you think there's no other reasoning behind it? Maybe, I don't know, resources in Ukraine, security reasons, obviously, because they want to expand NATO. So is it just this idea we're a superpower and that's why we're just going to do what we're going to do?
I think that's the overwhelming reason. I don't think you get huge economic returns out of this and so forth. It's actually been very costly. But the point I wanted to make is that Chancellor Merkel knew this is a bad idea. And she resisted and resisted, but the U.S. said, no, we're going to do it. And then she gave in. She gave in the decision of NATO to announce that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. That's the conclusion of the Bucharest summit. It's sad that she gave in. She knew it was a bad idea. She protested against it. But in the end, she didn't resist the U.S. pressure. I think that was really, unfortunately, a historic bad mistake, because if she had stood up to the U.S. pressure, the right outcome would have been achieved. No such declaration, and we would not have gone on to war. Of course, the war started 6 years afterwards in 2014 with the violent coup against Yanukovych, but all of that was part of a long-term U.S.-led process, and had Germany, especially Germany and France and Italy and other major countries of Europe resisted, we would not be where we are today. We would be in a much safer place. There would not be a war in Ukraine. Ukraine would not have lost a million people to death and grievous injury. So we would have been much better off. But the U.S. got its way, and we are where we are because of that.
What do you think is the difference from 2008, the Bucharest summit, to 2003, where the German government did resist in joining the war in Iraq? I mean, it's only 5 years if you really think about it.
No fundamental difference. I think it was a mistake, actually. Now, this is high stakes. People in these positions are consequential. They make decisions that have consequences. And I don't believe that it was the case that Chancellor Merkel had no choice, that it's inevitable, that the United States had to have its way. I don't believe that. I think these are decisions that are taken. This one was a bad decision. I believe, by the way, that even as late as 2021, before the escalation with the Russian invasion in February 2022, that invasion could have been avoided. And the reasoning is that Putin put on the table some very specific proposals to avoid that invasion, and the United States refused to negotiate over them. Once again, if at that stage the German government, together with the French government, together with Italy, maybe together with Spain, had said, look, we're at the core of this. NATO is not the United States. NATO is an alliance. We happen to live right here near Russia. We need a different approach rather than simply provocation. Even then, things could have changed. Of course, things had advanced a long way. Chancellor Merkel had made another mistake. And it's sad for me to say it, by the way, because I really admired her in many, many ways. I thought she was very serious, very consequent, very responsible, not a flighty person, but a very level-headed, very intelligent person and a very well-directed person. But she made another mistake, which was that Germany was the guarantor of the Minsk II agreement. The Minsk II agreement was an agreement reached in February 2014 to 2015, a year after the coup, to stop the escalating violence. And it could have done so. It was an agreement in which the breakaway parts of Ukraine, the Donbas region, Donetsk and Lugansk, would have received political autonomy. Well, it was voted by the UN Security Council. Germany and France were to be the guarantors of this UN-backed treaty. And the US and Ukraine blew it off, saying, we don't like it. It was with a gun to our head. We're not going to accept it. And unfortunately, the guarantors of the agreement, Germany and France, went along again with the US. And recently, of course, Chancellor Merkel, in a pretty infamous interview, said, well, it wasn't really an agreement, it was just to buy time. By the way, I don't believe that was her motive back in 2015. I think she really meant it.
That's interesting, because I was going to say, this is the last information I have about Minsk, that it was just implemented, or it wasn't implemented, but they discussed it, negotiated it just to buy time. But you say that back then when they did negotiate it, that you did take it seriously, or that they took it seriously. And then later she kind of backtracked on
exactly. That. I think later on, when it became so unpopular to have any kind of compromise with Putin, she backtracked and said, oh, no, it was a little bit of a trick. It wasn't real. But the fact of the matter is, it was a good agreement and it was a real agreement. And I believe she believed in it. And I have reason to know that, actually, in a kind of surprising way, which is that in major ways, the Minsk II agreement was modeled on the autonomy of the German-speaking Alpine region of Italy, Bolzano and South Tyrol.
Yeah, Südtirol.
Now, this is a German minority region which demanded autonomy after World War II. And at first there was a kind of pseudo-autonomy, but then there was protests and unrest, and then a real autonomy. Now it's a booming, happy region. Italy's very happy with it. Everybody likes the arrangements.
Beautiful region.
And what's interesting is that this was very much on Chancellor Merkel's mind, I'm told by people who know, as the model for what should happen in the Donbas. So I think she really believed in this approach. I believe in it. I don't think it was a bad agreement. It was a smart agreement. It would have ended the war. But the United States blew it off because the US the leaders are stupid. They're arrogant. They don't know what they're doing. They think they can do whatever they want. And so they didn't take it seriously, even though it was a UN Security Council, even though President Putin was also a big part of it, even though there was a Normandy process. It was serious, but not to the arrogant Americans. But what's unfortunate is Chancellor Merkel didn't stand up and say, we are the guarantors of this. You, Ukraine, must take it seriously. Germany went silent. France went silent. And so, in a sense, what we've seen since 2008, in my interpretation, is that the major European countries just bent to the U.S. will. I don't really know why that is. Honest to goodness, I don't know why that is.
You make it sound very human from what you're saying. Like, you're saying American leaders, they're just stupid, like they're arrogant. So this is a very human characteristic to have.
Yes.
And then when you talk about like mistakes that were made, just like Iraq or like Ukraine, or not adhering to Minsk and not saying, yes, we're the guarantors of Minsk, so we're going to pull through. it just makes it sound very human that these were just human errors, human mistakes that are, like you said, very consequential, because we're talking about people who are elite politicians. And when they make a decision, it affects millions of people.
That's exactly right. And I should clarify that when it comes to the U.S., these are decisions that were taken decades ago, in a sense, because it's not ad hoc decisions. Back in the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union ended, the CIA, the Pentagon, the security state apparatus of the U.S. said, okay, now we're the sole superpower. Now we're in charge. Russia's weak. We can do what we want. That was the mindset. And the decision was taken, we know now, by historians, by people who participated already back in 1994, that the U.S. would lead NATO eastward, contravening the solemn promises that were made in 1990 in Germany as part of German reunification on February 9th, 1990, when James Baker III, our Secretary of State, said to President Mikhail Gorbachev, NATO will move not 1 inch eastward. But the United States, deep state, said, we don't have to abide by that. They're not even here anymore. So Clinton, already in 1994, started the eastward process by internal agreement. The first actual policies were revealed in the second half of the 1990s, but the decisions were taken in 1994. So I don't want to say that it's ad hoc decisions by the U.S. It's consistently stupid decisions based on a strategy that was an arrogant, hubristic strategy. But what I do say is that Germany could have stopped it, because it wasn't just German opposition. Europeans knew all along, this is a bad idea, this is provocative, why stir up the big bear to our east? This is a big country, things are quiet and fine, why stir things up? And they tried to explain that to the United States, in my interpretation, but the U.S. doesn't listen. So at that point, German leaders had a decision: make the U.S. listen, say, no, we're not going to have a conclusion of the Bucharest summit, in which case the U.S., in my view, would have had to back down, or consent, but then with huge consequences. I can tell you another European leader who is around today as a leader was involved in 2008 and said to me afterwards, personally, again, what is your president doing? This is so reckless. This is so irresponsible. They promised us, this person explained to me, that they wouldn't do this. And then Bush went off on Christmas vacation and they came back and they announced we're expanding NATO. Okay, this is a European leader who wouldn't dream of saying this publicly right now. But I not only heard it with my own ears, this is somebody I'm friendly with. And it's extremely annoying and disappointing, actually, because these are not high school games. This is not a board game. This is not a poker game. This is real life with hundreds of thousands of people dying because of these decisions. Europe knew it. The United States is stupid. I'm going to say it again. I mean the leaders who are basically arrogant is the right point. Stupid means they're so arrogant they can't see through their own arrogance. They think they call the shots. And the European leaders let them do it for at least the last 16 years since 2008.
While the American leaders may be arrogant, the European leaders are obviously spineless, I would
Completely.
say. So I think that one kind of feeds into the other, because one wouldn't happen without the other. Now, I have so many questions to ask, because you mentioned so many things. You mentioned the 90s in Russia, where you also advised Boris Yeltsin, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and Gorbachev.
And Gorbachev. Do you think well, back then, now this is my interpretation, you may contradict as we go along. As far as I'm concerned, you were also known as somewhat of an economic magician or a shock therapist back then. So you introduced some depends on who looks at it, radical economic reforms that were in my opinion, probably necessary in certain countries. Do you think that these, some would probably call them neoliberal reforms, kind of paved the way for NATO expansion?
No, not at all. First of all, everything that is said about this is simple-minded. I was and am good at financial stabilization of a country that is financially destabilized. That's my expertise, that's my experience, and I've done it many times successfully. One of the core lessons of economic stabilization is it sure helps to have some support in a timely way from outside.
What does that mean?
It means that if a country is in a hyperinflation or can't pay its debts, that someone on the outside, a foreign government or foreign agencies, give loans to help stabilize the situation, not to make things worse. And I learned this, the basics of the trade, in part through the experience of Germany after World War I, because probably the most famous book about economic crises ever written was John Maynard Keynes' book about the Treaty of Versailles, written in 1919, called The Economic Consequences of the Peace. And he was protesting the harsh settlement of the Versailles Treaty, which put all the blame on Germany, put all the reparations on Germany, and so forth. And Keynes said, this is not good. This is not the right way to settle a war. War should be settled with magnanimity and with some economic sense. Don't put the reparations on so heavily. This will lead to political backlash. This will lead to unrest. Okay, I studied this. I thought about this. I helped end hyperinflations in Latin America. I helped negotiate debt relief in Latin America and then in Poland. And in Poland in 1989, it was an extremely financially unstable country that had defaulted many years earlier, martial law, all the history of the 1980s. And then suddenly it became a democratic post-communist country, even before the fall of the Berlin Wall. The first elections in Eastern Europe that were really contested after World War II occurred in Poland on June 4th, 1989. I became, for a number of reasons, both because of my substantive knowledge and just being there and the oddity of experience, I became their main advisor. So I watched the transformation very close up, and I helped to call some of the main policy shots, including debt cancellation, emergency loans, something that I invented called the Zloty Stabilization Fund to help stabilize the currency. I mention all of this because that's what I do. So it wasn't that I'm a neoliberal. I'm, by the way, philosophically a social democrat and always have been. I like a mixed economy. I want government to take care of people, healthcare, and so forth. That's been my philosophy my whole life.
I think the reason people criticize certain policies is because they came at a cost. So if we're talking about certain,
but look, like the reason they criticize, people don't understand an economic crisis. Period. I'm sorry to say
that might very well be true.
They just don't.
Yeah.
So let me just finish what I was saying. I had to come to Bonn, actually, then to explain Germany has to help Poland. And there were officials here, well, they owe their debt, you know. I said, no, they don't just owe their debt. You have to forgive their debt. And I had to explain here, by the way, that in 1953, the Nazi-era debt was forgiven by the Western countries to give the Federal Republic of Germany a fresh start. I said, you have to do the same with Poland. They said, oh, yes, that's a good point, Mr. Sachs. And Germany agreed. Poland got help. And it stabilized and started growing. It wasn't some evil shock therapy, neoliberal, blah, blah, blah. No, just to explain, let me finish. It was sensible economic stabilization. Now, I was asked then by Gorbachev, by his economic team, help us do the same thing. I said, absolutely. The West helped Poland. Now the West will help you. And I was part of a project at Harvard in 1991 in the spring called The Grand Bargain, which was to lay out the West could give major loans and financing for the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union would democratize and in an orderly way make a transformation to a market economy and democratic system. You know what the White House said? No, period. They didn't say, oh, interesting ideas. Well, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could do that. They said, no. I've recently read the National Security Council minutes of the meeting where they said no. I had never seen that. Somebody sent them to me from the historical archives just recently. You know what? A bunch of idiots. One of them, somebody I knew and never liked, said, we have to do the minimum possible without them collapsing, but the minimum possible. There's a word for that I can't use in polite company. That is really, really stupid. Then, when Gorbachev just had nothing and the situation was collapsing, he went home to a putsch in the summer of 1991. Boris Yeltsin stood on a tank in Moscow and said, I'm the leader of Russia and I will lead us out of this mess. And in the next month, in September 1991, Boris Yeltsin's advisor, Yegor Gaidar, called me, said, we want your help because we need help. We've got debts that we can't pay. We're out of foreign exchange reserves. There's nothing in the shops. The black market prices are soaring and so forth. And I went to the dacha of the Russian government. By the way, the dacha was in such bad shape. Nothing worked. Everything had fallen apart in this place. And in December 1991, I sat here, and where you are sitting right across from me was Boris Yeltsin. He came into the room. He sat in front of me. I had colleagues on the side. I was the lead of the delegation. I was kind of a young person at the time. And he said, I want to tell you the Soviet Union is over. We were there at the moment that he had negotiated the end of the Soviet Union. And then he said in a very lucid way, we want freedom, we want to be normal, we want to be democratic, we want to be a market economy. Then it was my time to speak. And I said, Mr. President, this is one of the most important moments of modern history. It's such an honor to be here. And I'm sure that the Western world will help you to accomplish this, because this is for peace, this is for our future, and what you are doing is something we need to support. I have no doubt, Mr. President, the Western world will support you. Well, how wrong I was about that. Not about my economic advice, which was completely rejected by Washington, because they didn't want to do anything. That's what this is all about. And so I got the glimpse. By the way, I really didn't understand it because I couldn't imagine how foolish my compatriots were until years afterwards. And then now I know there's almost no limit to how stupid they can be. But that's what this story is about.
You make it sound like that in the upper echelons or the elite political circles, that there's a bunch of arrogant, not qualified individuals that are making decisions that are consequential for millions and millions of people on this planet.
The only thing I disagree with you is it's about billions of people.